Okay, so let's go on to body tissues. So we're finished with the organelles and the discussion of how the organelles interact with each other and their primary function. Let's go on to body tissues. Okay, and we group body tissues into cells that are very similar in function and in structure. Okay, so what are the four main types of body tissues? Well, we're going to talk about epithelial tissue, connective tissue, muscle tissue, and nervous tissue. Okay, so those are the four main groups, and it's important to know a bit about them. They all have different functions. Okay, and this slide is showing you some images of examples of the different tissues. So skin would be considered epithelial tissue. There's an assortment of different types of muscles. So whether it's the smooth muscle of your gastrointestinal system, your skeletal system muscles, which allows movement of your body, and cardiac muscle is its own group as well. Okay, so there's three groupings for muscle tissues. The connective tissue we'll talk about is what holds the body together. So we'll go into detail about that, the different types of connective tissue. And then finally, nervous tissue, which is going to be neurons and supporting cells for the neurons. Okay, so what is epithelial tissue? Well, that is the tissue that covers the outer surface of organs. So it's going to be lining of internal surfaces, such as the intestines, the stomach, the lining of the lungs on the inside, and also the outside of the lungs. All the glandular tissues that secrete into the intestine, such as the pancreas, would be considered epithelial because there's a part of the pancreas that has an exocrine role, meaning it secretes enzymes out of the body into the gastrointestinal tract, compared to its endocrine function, where it secretes insulin into the bloodstream. The basement membrane that attaches epithelial cells, say of your skin, to the lower connective tissues, say the subcutaneous tissue. Often epithelial tissue tends to be avascular, so the skin cells on the surface are really quite avascular. They don't have blood vessels within them. The cells are typically very tightly packed together and rapidly divide. Okay, so when we look at the skin, the gastrointestinal system, all the linings of the GI system, including your mouth, esophagus, stomach, small intestine, large intestine, they all have rapidly dividing cells. Okay. And epithelial tissue is just classified by its shape. So you could have simple squamous, you could have cuboidal cells, columnar cells, because they look like columns. Just different types of epithelial tissue based on the shape. And the shape is usually because of the role it's performing. Okay, so as we go through epithelial tissue, you will see that there's different types of epithelial tissue in terms of shape because of the of the functions that it's performing. Okay, so these are all epithelial tissues. So whether it's in the mouth, in the bronchial tubes, on the skin, in the gastrointestinal tract, they're all epithelial tissue, but they all can have slightly different shapes. And because of that, we describe them a bit differently based on their shape, just to be a bit more accurate. But they still are all epithelial tissue. If you look at this image, there's really three main shapes of epithelial cells. There's squamous, columnar, and cuboidal. And these can be arranged as a single layer, such as simple epithelium, or it can be arranged in 2 or more layers, and then we would call it stratified. So the function of epithelial cells depends on where they are. So if we're talking about epithelial cells within the pancreas, it would be secretion of enzymes. If we're talking about the epithelial cells of the gastrointestinal tract, it would be absorption. If we're referring to the skin, it would be protection, right? So it just depends on where we're talking about the epithelial tissue, okay? So just understand where epithelial tissue is within the body. Okay, so here's an example of epithelial tissue in the respiratory system, in the bronchial tubes, and they have cilia, which are hair-like projections that come from the cells, and they allow for movement up and out of the respiratory system. So it allows for either movement of mucus out of the lungs so it can be cleared and coughed up, or if you've inhaled, say, pollution or antigens, which is foreign substances, into the lungs, the cilia can gradually move them back up and get them out of the bronchial tubes, okay? The cilia are actually one of the main components that stop working with cigarette smoking, okay? And that is often why smokers end up with a chronic cough, because of the irritation that occurs not only from the cigarette smoke and all the carcinogens that are within it, but also because the cilia are unable to clear the pollution or other inhaled molecules because the cilia have stopped functioning. Okay, so they're very important in the bronchial tube lining to clear foreign substances. So here's an image within epithelial tissue of either the lung or the gastrointestinal tract of goblet cells, and these cells constantly produce small amounts of mucus. And what does the mucus do? It in the pulmonary system, in the lungs, it allows it to accumulate the debris and pollution, and allows the person to cough it up as sputum. Okay, it also lubricates the bronchial tubes as well. In the gastrointestinal tract, the mucus forms a protective layer, and it keeps the cells moisturized, right? From drying, it prevents them from drying out. So your whole gastrointestinal tract is actually quite slimy on the inside lumen, because the goblet cells are constantly producing mucus to maintain lubrication, which allows food to continue sliding through. And it gives protection to the cells so they don't get damaged from food substances and other substances that may have been toxic in the food, or drugs, for example, to harm the epithelial tissue. Okay, so here's two other examples of epithelial tissue. The inside of the bladder has epithelial lining, epithelial cells. Remember, on the outside of organs and the lining of the inside of organs, it's epithelium. And the inside of the stomach, in the lower right, is epithelial cells, and they're typically in the shape of columnar. So simple columnar cells. If you were to go back into the esophagus from the stomach, it would be just simple epithelial cells. Okay? Now, as an example of what can happen when acid, for example, from the stomach goes back up into the esophagus in a condition called, well, we can call it heartburn, or we can call it gastroesophageal reflux disease. You have reflux of acid back into the esophagus. Well, the esophagus just has squamous epithelium. Okay, so not really made for the acid that's going to now wash upon it. So it's able to change its cells to columnar cells, right? So it's able to adjust what kind of epithelial tissue it has because of what's impacting it. Okay, so cells can adapt. So tissue can adapt based on what's happening in the environment. And the esophagus is a perfect example where it could go from a squamous epithelium to a columnar epithelial tissue to protect itself from the acid that's washing onto it from the stomach. So glands are also part of epithelial tissue, right? I mean, as an example, we have sweat glands and oil glands in our epithelial tissue of our skin. And when we talk about glands that are secreting oils or sweat to the surface of an area, whether it's the surface of your skin or the surface of the inside of the digestive tract, we call that an exocrine gland, right? So it's exiting. So whether it's exiting onto the skin or exiting into the gastrointestinal tract, it's an exocrine gland, okay? And the skin is filled with exocrine glands, as I mentioned, for oils, which we'll talk about when we review acne, sweat glands. The gastrointestinal tract is full of different types of glands that are secreting mucus, some that are secreting digestive enzymes to break down the food. Okay, endocrine glands, which we'll cover in another module, are glands that secrete into the bloodstream, right? So the pancreas is a perfect example that secretes insulin into the bloodstream, or the adrenal gland that secretes cortisol into the bloodstream, or the thyroid gland that secretes thyroid hormone into the bloodstream. Okay, so one's exocrine, one's endocrine. And the pancreas, by the way, is endocrine and exocrine. Endocrine by secreting insulin into the bloodstream, exocrine by secreting pancreatic enzymes into the gastrointestinal tract.